They say the worst sound at a wedding is silence. They're wrong. The worst sound is the whisper that follows it. London, 1818. St. George's Church, Hanover Square. The pews were full, the flowers were arranged, the vows were written. Lady Margaret Hale stood at the altar in ivory silk, her hands trembling beneath her bouquet, her eyes fixed on the empty doorway where her groom should have appeared. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became 30. The guests began to shift, to murmur, to exchange knowing glances that felt like daggers pressed against her spine. He wasn't coming. Margaret had prepared herself for many things on her wedding day. Nerves, tears, even doubt. But she had not prepared herself for this. The slow, creeping realization that she had been abandoned in front of 200 witnesses, in the most public declaration of unworthiness a woman could endure. The whispers grew louder, sharper. Her mother's face had gone white. Her father's jaw was clenched so tightly she thought it might crack. And still the doorway remained empty. She was about to turn, to flee, to salvage whatever shred of dignity remained, when a voice cut through the rising noise like a blade through silk. Forgive the interruption. Every head turned. From the very last pew, where the least important guests were meant to sit, rose a man Margaret had only ever seen from a distance. Tall, dark-haired, unnervingly composed. The Duke of Westley. He did not hurry. He did not apologize. He simply walked down the aisle with the calm authority of a man who had never been questioned in his life, his gaze fixed not on the crowd but on her. When he reached the altar, he turned to face the assembled guests, his voice steady and unmistakable. The wedding will not proceed. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone's entire life changed in an instant? And if this hooked you, hit that like and subscribe. This story is just getting started. They say the worst sound at a wedding is silence. They're wrong. The worst sound is the whisper that follows it. Lady Margaret Hale had heard many things whispered about her over the years. That she was too tall for a woman of proper breeding. That her dowry was respectable but not spectacular. That at 23 she had lingered on the marriage mart longer than was entirely fashionable. None of those whispers had prepared her for the ones she would hear on what was supposed to be her wedding day. The morning had begun as mornings do when one's life is about to change irrevocably. Her maid had woken her before dawn, and the preparations had commenced with the efficient precision of a military campaign. The ivory silk gown had been pressed and repressed until every fold lay perfect. Her dark hair had been arranged and rearranged, pinned with orange blossoms that filled her chamber with their heavy, sweet scent. Her mother had wept, as mothers do, though Margaret suspected the tears were born more from relief than sentiment. After all, Margaret was finally to be married. Respectably. Appropriately. To Mr. Thomas Whitmore, a gentleman of good family and adequate fortune, whose proposal had been accepted with gratitude rather than passion. Margaret had harbored no illusions about the match. She was not a romantic, had never been prone to flights of fancy or dramatic declarations. She understood marriage as her mother had taught her to understand it, as a contract, a necessity, a means by which a woman secured her future and elevated her family's standing. Mr. Whitmore was handsome enough, polite enough, ambitious enough. He would do. And so she had accepted him when he asked, had endured the congratulations and the planning, had submitted to the fittings and the visiting and the endless discussions of settlements and wedding breakfasts. She had done everything a dutiful daughter ought to do. Now, standing in the vestibule of St. George's Church in Hanover Square, listening to the organ's processional swell through the heavy wooden doors, Margaret smoothed her hands over her silk skirts and told herself that this was what she wanted, what she had agreed to, what she had prepared for. Her father stood beside her, his arm crooked and waiting. Lord Hale was not a demonstrative man, but he patted her hand with something approaching tenderness. "Ready, my dear?" Margaret nodded, though her throat had gone inexplicably tight. "Yes, Papa." The doors opened. The music surged. And Margaret stepped into the church on her father's arm, into the culmination of months of planning, into the moment that would define the rest of her life. St. George's was full. Every pew gleamed with silk and superfine, with ostrich plumes and jeweled brooches, with the cream of London society gathered to witness the union of Miss Margaret Hale and Mr. Thomas Whitmore. Candles blazed from every sconce. Flowers cascaded from every available surface, their perfume competing with the ladies' French scents and the lingering incense from morning services. Margaret kept her eyes forward as she walked, her steps measured and careful on the stone floor. She could feel the weight of 200 gazes upon her, assessing, judging, cataloging every detail to be discussed later over tea and cards. Her dress, her complexion, her composure. Whether she looked appropriately bridal, appropriately modest, appropriately grateful to have secured a match at her age. She had learned long ago not to let such scrutiny affect her. She kept her chin level, her expression serene, her breathing steady beneath the tight lacing of her stays. The altar loomed ahead, decorated with more white roses and trailing ivy. The vicar stood waiting, his prayer book open, his face arranged in the benevolent expression he wore for all the ceremonies he performed. And beside him, where the groom should be standing, nothing. The space was empty. Margaret's steps faltered for the briefest moment before she caught herself and continued forward. Perhaps Mr. Whitmore had stepped aside for a moment. Perhaps he was speaking with his groomsmen. Perhaps there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for why he was not yet in his place. But as she drew closer, as her father led her the final few steps to the altar, she saw the vicar's expression shift from benevolent to uncertain. Saw him glance toward the side door, then back at her, then toward the guests with something approaching alarm. And still the groom's place remained empty. Margaret reached the altar. Stopped. Turned her head fractionally to the left, where Mr. Whitmore should have been waiting to take her hand. He was not there. Her father cleared his throat softly. The vicar shuffled his prayer book. The organ music had stopped, and in its absence the silence was absolute. Margaret stood very still, her bouquet of white roses trembling slightly in her hands, and waited. Surely he would appear any moment. Surely this was merely some small delay, some last-minute adjustment to his cravat or his nerves. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The silence began to fracture. A cough from somewhere in the middle pews. The rustle of silk as someone shifted position. A whispered word quickly hushed. Margaret's heart had begun to beat very fast beneath her ivory bodice. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to look at the faces she could feel turning toward her with increasing speculation. Beside her, her father had gone rigid, his jaw clenched. Perhaps, the vicar began, his voice pitched low and uncertain, perhaps we might inquire. He did not finish. Because at that moment the side door opened and Mr. Whitmore's groomsman appeared. He was alone. His face was pale, his expression stricken. He approached the vicar and spoke in a hurried whisper that was nonetheless audible in the terrible quiet. He's not come. I've sent men to his lodgings. There's no sign of him. The vicar's eyes widened. Margaret's father made a sound low in his throat that might have been anger or shock or both. And Margaret understood, with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact, that her groom was not delayed. He was not adjusting his cravat or steadying his nerves. He was not coming at all. The whispers began immediately. Like water finding cracks in stone, they spread through the assembled guests in a rising tide of speculation and scandal. Not here. Surely not. Has he truly? The poor girl? What could she have? Margaret stood at the altar in her ivory silk and orange blossoms, her bouquet still clutched in hands that had gone numb, and felt the weight of 200 gazes shift from curiosity to pity to something far worse. Judgment. Because this was not merely inconvenience. This was not simply an embarrassing delay. This was abandonment. Public, witnessed, undeniable abandonment. And in the unforgiving mathematics of Regency society, abandonment meant only one thing, that there was something fundamentally wrong with the woman who had been left behind. Some flaw, some failing, some essential unworthiness that had driven her intended husband to flee rather than bind himself to her. Margaret's mother had risen from her seat in the front pew, her face white, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her father's grip on her arm had tightened until it was almost painful. Around them, the whispers grew louder, more pointed, edged with the particular cruelty that fashionable society reserved for those who had fallen from grace. She needed to move, to do something, to salvage whatever fragments of dignity remained before the scandal consumed her entirely. But her limbs felt frozen, her mind blank with shock and a humiliation so profound it was almost numbing. The vicar was speaking to her father in urgent undertones. Her mother was being supported by her sister, who had come forward from the family pew. The guests were half rising from their seats, craning to see better, to witness more fully the spectacle of her disgrace. And then, cutting through the rising chaos with the precision of a blade through silk, a voice spoke from the back of the church. Forgive the interruption. Every head turned. Every whisper stopped. From the very last pew, where only the least important guests were relegated, a man rose to his feet. Margaret, still standing frozen at the altar, could see him only as a dark figure against the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an unhurried confidence that seemed entirely at odds with the pandemonium unfolding around him. He stepped into the aisle and began to walk toward the altar. As he drew closer, Margaret recognized him, though they had never been formally introduced. Everyone in London society knew the Duke of Westley, at least by sight. He was a man of considerable power and wealth, known for his reserve, his refusal to involve himself in scandal or gossip, his careful selection of social engagements. He attended only the most essential events, spoke only when necessary, and maintained a reputation for both integrity and aloofness that made him one of the most respected men in England. What he was doing here, in the last pew of her wedding ceremony, Margaret could not begin to fathom. But he was walking toward her now with the calm, measured steps of a man entirely unintimidated by the 200 pairs of eyes fixed upon him. When he reached the altar, he turned to face the assembled guests. His expression was composed, almost severe, his dark eyes surveying the crowd with an authority that seemed to freeze them all in place. "The wedding will not proceed," he said, his voice carrying easily through the church's vaulted space. Shocked silence. Then an eruption of whispers 3 times louder than before. The Duke raised one hand slightly, and the whispers died as though he had commanded them to cease. "The absence of the groom is not abandonment," he continued, his tone measured and deliberate. "It is necessity." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she thought the entire church must hear it. She stared at the Duke, unable to comprehend what was happening, why he was speaking, what he could possibly mean. "I take full responsibility for preventing this marriage," the Duke said, and the church erupted again into barely suppressed chaos. "Mr. Whitmore was informed late last evening that his attendance today would result in public exposure of matters that would prove detrimental to all parties involved." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd. Margaret saw her father's expression shift from shock to confusion to something approaching understanding. Saw the vicar's mouth open and close without sound. Saw the guests exchanging frantic glances, trying to decipher what scandal could possibly justify such an extraordinary intervention. The Duke turned then for the first time to look directly at Margaret. His eyes were dark gray, she noticed distantly, and held an expression she could not quite interpret. Not pity. Not triumph. Something else entirely. "Lady Margaret," he said quietly, though his voice still carried to every corner of the church. "I regret the circumstances, but I could not in good conscience allow this marriage to proceed. You have been saved from a union that would have brought you nothing but harm." He extended his arm to her, a gesture of protection rather than possession. "Will you permit me to escort you from the church?" Margaret stood frozen for a long moment, her mind racing. She did not know this man, did not understand what he had just done or why. But she understood one thing with perfect clarity. If she refused his escort, if she turned away from him now, she would be left standing alone at an altar where her groom had failed to appear, with no explanation, no protection, no defense against the scandal that would destroy her. The Duke of Westley was offering her something. She did not know what, precisely. But it was more than anyone else in this church was offering. More than the pitying glances. More than the whispered speculations. It was a way out. Margaret laid her hand on his arm. Her bouquet slipped from her other hand and fell to the floor in a scatter of white petals. "Thank you, Your Grace," she heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Distant. Hollow. The Duke's arm was solid beneath her hand as he turned and began to walk her back down the aisle. Away from the empty altar. Away from the vicar and her parents and the 200 witnesses to her humiliation. Through the center of the church, past rows of shocked, staring faces, past whispers that rose like a wave in their wake. Margaret kept her chin level. Kept her eyes forward. Kept walking one step after another, her hand on the arm of a man she did not know, toward a future she could not even begin to imagine. Behind them the church dissolved into chaos. Ahead, the doors stood open to the bright afternoon light. Anne Margaret Hale, who had entered St. George's as a bride, walked out as something else entirely. Something undefined. Something that would be dissected and debated and destroyed in drawing rooms across London before the sun set on this terrible day. The Duke's carriage waited outside. He handed her into it with the same calm efficiency he had shown throughout this entire incomprehensible scene. Margaret sank onto the velvet seat, her ivory silk pooling around her, her mind still blank with shock. The Duke climbed in beside her and rapped on the ceiling. The carriage lurched into motion. Only then, as they pulled away from St. George's Church and the scandal she had left behind, did Margaret allow herself to turn and look at the man who had just irrevocably altered her fate. "Why?" she whispered. The Duke met her gaze steadily. "Because," he said quietly, "you deserve the truth. And I am the only one who could give it to you." The carriage rolled through the streets of Mayfair, carrying Margaret away from everything she had known, everything she had planned, everything she had believed her life would be. And beside her, silent and watchful, sat the Duke who had saved her reputation by destroying her wedding, who had protected her by binding his name to hers in the most public way imaginable. Margaret did not know what happened next. Did not know what truth he claimed to possess or why he had chosen this moment to reveal it. Did not know whether she had been saved or simply caught in a different kind of scandal. But as the church bells of St. George's began to toll the hour behind them, marking time that should have been spent witnessing her vows. Margaret understood one thing with absolute certainty. Her life had just changed irrevocably, and she had no idea whether it was for better or worse. The carriage deposited Margaret at her family's townhouse in Berkeley Square with the same efficiency that had characterized the Duke's entire intervention. He handed her down, murmured something about calling upon her father within the hour, and departed before she could form a coherent response. Margaret stood on the pavement in her ivory silk wedding gown, orange blossoms still pinned in her hair, and watched his carriage disappear around the corner. Then she turned and walked through her own front door into a house that felt suddenly unfamiliar. The servants' faces told her everything. The footman's carefully blank expression. The housekeeper's shocked sympathy. The maid who rushed forward to take her wrap and then seemed uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. News traveled fast in London. Apparently, it traveled faster than a duke's carriage. Margaret's mother met her in the entrance hall, having arrived moments earlier in the family's own carriage. Lady Hale's face was blotchy with tears, her elegant coiffure disheveled from where she had clearly been clutching at it in distress. "Margaret," she breathed and then seemed unable to continue. "I am well, Mama," Margaret said, though she was not entirely certain it was true. She felt oddly detached from her own body, as though she were watching herself from a great distance. "Merely tired." "Tired?" her mother repeated faintly. "Oh, my dear girl. What are we to do? What will people say? The Duke of Westley stopping your wedding, making such claims in front of everyone, and Thomas not even there to defend himself." "I believe that was rather the point, Mama," Margaret said quietly. "That Mr. Whitmore could not defend himself." Her mother pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "Your father is still at the church, attempting to manage things." "Oh, Margaret, this is a disaster. An absolute disaster." It was. Margaret knew that with the same distant clarity that seemed to have overtaken all her thoughts. By this evening, every drawing room in Mayfair would be discussing what had happened at St. George's. By tomorrow, the scandal sheets would have crafted their most creative interpretations. By the end of the week, her name would be synonymous with humiliation, scandal, and whatever lurid theories society had concocted to explain the Duke's extraordinary intervention. "I should like to change," Margaret said. The wedding gown suddenly felt unbearably heavy, each fold of silk a reminder of vows that had never been spoken. "And perhaps rest for a while." Her mother nodded, seeming relieved to have something practical to focus upon. Yes, of course. I'll send Betsy up to help you. And then we must talk, you and I and your father, about what is to be done." What is to be done? As though this were a problem that could be solved through discussion and planning. As though her reputation had not just been shredded in the most public venue imaginable. Margaret climbed the stairs to her bedchamber, each step an effort. Betsy was already there, her young face creased with worry, and she helped Margaret out of the ivory silk with gentle efficiency. The orange blossoms were unpinned and set aside. The pearl combs removed from her hair. The delicate slippers unlaced. When Margaret finally stood in her shift and wrapper, her wedding costume draped over a chair like the shed skin of some other woman's life, she felt marginally more capable of thought. "Will there be anything else, miss?" Betsy asked softly. "No. Thank you, Betsy." The maid curtsied and left, and Margaret was alone. She moved to the window and looked out over Berkeley Square. Afternoon sun slanted across the elegant facades of the surrounding townhouses. A gentleman's coach passed by. Two ladies strolled with their maid trailing behind. Everything looked exactly as it had this morning, when Margaret had been preparing for her wedding day. But nothing was the same. The Duke of Westley had seen to that. Margaret pressed her forehead against the cool glass and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what had happened. The shock. The humiliation. The terrible, gaping uncertainty of what came next. Then she straightened, drew a breath, and began to think. By evening, the situation had clarified into something almost worse than the initial chaos. Margaret's father returned from the church grim-faced and silent. The family gathered in the drawing room. Mother, father, Margaret, and her younger sister Cecilia, who had been kept home from the wedding due to a convenient cold and now seemed torn between horror at the scandal and disappointment at having missed the spectacle. "The invitations have already begun to be withdrawn," Lord Hale said without preamble. Lady Bexley sent a note claiming a sudden illness. "The Fortescues have departed for the country unexpectedly." Mrs. Helmsley expressed her deep regrets but felt it would be inappropriate to proceed with Thursday's card party given the circumstances. Margaret's mother made a small sound of distress. Margaret herself sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. "What did the Duke say?" she asked. "When he called upon you?" Her father's expression shifted to something complicated. Confusion, perhaps. Or reluctant respect. "He provided an explanation." though I confess I am still attempting to understand the full scope of what he revealed. Then perhaps you might share it with me, Margaret said quietly, as it concerns my own life rather intimately. Her father had the grace to look abashed. He crossed to the sideboard and poured himself a brandy, took a long swallow, then turned to face her. The Duke claims to have been investigating Mr. Whitmore for the past several months. He has evidence, documented evidence, he assured me, that the man is deeply in debt. Not merely the usual gentleman's obligations, but serious debts to moneylenders, creditors, gaming hells. Amounts that would take years to repay even with careful management. Margaret's stomach tightened. I see. There's more. Her father's voice had gone hard. According to Westley, Whitmore had no intention of repaying these debts through his own efforts. He intended to marry well and use his wife's dowry to settle his obligations. The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, Cecilia's shocked whisper. He was marrying me for my money, Margaret said. It was not a question. For your dowry, yes, and for the family connections that would follow. Westley claims Whitmore had already made agreements with his creditors based on the expectation of your marriage settlement. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. Not shock, she was beyond shock now. Something closer to resignation. Of course Mr. Whitmore had been marrying her for practical reasons. She had known that. Had accepted it as the natural order of such arrangements. But there was a difference between a marriage of mutual convenience and calculated deception. Between a union that served both parties and one designed solely to exploit. How did the Duke discover this? She asked. Her father shook his head. He did not provide details. Only assured me that his sources were reliable and his evidence sound. He said he had been attempting to gather sufficient proof to expose Whitmore's duplicity without causing undue scandal, but time ran short. When it became clear the wedding would proceed before he could act more discreetly, he chose the only option he felt would protect you. By destroying my reputation in the most public way imaginable? By preventing you from binding yourself legally to a man who would have ruined you financially and socially within a year. Margaret rose from her seat and moved to the window, unable to remain still any longer. Outside, the square was settling into evening. Lamplighters were making their rounds. Carriages were departing for dinner engagements and theater performances that Margaret would no longer be invited to attend. Why? She asked, not turning around. Why would the Duke of Westley concern himself with my welfare? We have never even been introduced. I asked him the same question, her father said quietly. He said he could not in good conscience stand by and watch a woman of good character be sacrificed to a scoundrel's schemes. He said that if society chose to punish him for preventing the marriage, that was a consequence he was prepared to accept. Margaret turned to face her father. And do you believe him? Lord Hale met her gaze steadily. I do. Westley has a reputation for integrity that is unimpeachable. If he says he has evidence of Whitmore's duplicity, then I believe such evidence exists. Moreover, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. He has placed himself at considerable risk by intervening as he did. The speculation about his motives will be intense. There will be those who assume he acted out of personal interest in you, which will tie both your names together in ways that could prove complicated. How thoughtful of him, Margaret said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Her mother spoke up for the first time. Margaret, you must understand. Without the Duke's intervention, without his public claim of responsibility, you would be seen as a woman so flawed that her own betrothed fled rather than marry her. The scandal would be insurmountable. But with Westley's involvement, with his assertion that he prevented the marriage for your protection, society may yet be persuaded to view you as a victim rather than a reject. Margaret absorbed this, recognizing the truth in it even as something in her recoiled at the manipulation. She had been given no choice in any of this. Not in Mr. Whitmore's deception. Not in the Duke's intervention. Not in how society would interpret events. She had simply been acted upon, by men who presumed to know what was best for her. I should like to speak with the Duke, she said. Privately. Her father frowned. Margaret. He has involved himself in my affairs. He has made claims about my former betrothed and taken actions that have irrevocably altered my circumstances. I believe I am entitled to hear his explanations directly, rather than filtered through others. Her parents exchanged a glance. Then her father nodded slowly. I will arrange it. Tomorrow perhaps. Here, with propriety observed. Thank you, Papa. The Duke of Westley called at Berkeley Square the following afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock. Margaret received him in the smaller drawing room, with her mother seated in the corner as chaperone. Lady Hale had a book open in her lap, though Margaret suspected she would not miss a word of the conversation. The Duke was dressed impeccably in dark superfine and buff pantaloons, his cravat tied with understated elegance. He bowed to Margaret, greeted her mother with proper courtesy, and then waited to be invited to sit. Margaret gestured to the chair across from hers. "Please, Your Grace." He sat with the same controlled grace he seemed to bring to every movement. Up close, in the light of day, Margaret could see details she had missed in the chaos of yesterday's events. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he was perhaps in his early 30s, the watchful intelligence in his gray gaze, the sense of carefully contained power that seemed to emanate from him even in stillness. "Lady Margaret," he said quietly, "I hope you are well. As well as can be expected, given that my wedding was disrupted and my reputation is now the subject of intense speculation across London," Margaret replied evenly. A flicker of something, acknowledgement, perhaps, or respect, crossed his features. "I understand your anger." "Do you?" Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps you can help me understand, Your Grace. Because I confess I am struggling to comprehend why a man I have never met, never spoken to, would involve himself so dramatically in my personal affairs." The Duke was silent for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "I became aware of Mr. Whitmore's financial difficulties approximately 4 months ago. A business associate mentioned in passing that Whitmore had been seeking investors for a venture that proved to be entirely fabricated. I made inquiries. What I discovered was deeply troubling. My father mentioned debts. Substantial debts. More than £15,000 owed to various creditors, with additional obligations to several gaming establishments and private moneylenders of questionable character." Margaret's breath caught. £15,000. That was more than many gentlemen earned in 5 years. "I continued investigating," the Duke said. "I learned that Mr. Whitmore had approached your father last autumn with a proposal of marriage, that the courtship had been brief, that the wedding was arranged with unusual haste. My father was pleased by the match," Margaret said quietly. "Mr. Whitmore's family is respectable. His prospects seemed good." "His prospects were non-existent," the Duke said bluntly. "He had been cut off by his own father after a series of disastrous investments. The debts I mentioned are his own, accrued through reckless gambling and poor judgment. He was desperate, and desperate men make dangerous husbands." Margaret absorbed this, her mind racing. "When did you know for certain? That he intended to use your dowry to settle his debts?" 3 weeks ago. I obtained copies of correspondence between Whitmore and his creditors in which he explicitly promised payment upon his marriage. He had already negotiated terms based on the expectation of your settlement. The cold feeling in Margaret's chest intensified. "Why did you not simply inform my father?" The Duke's expression tightened fractionally. "I attempted to. I called upon Lord Hale 2 weeks ago and requested a private audience. He was not receptive to hearing concerns about a man he had already accepted as his son-in-law. He suggested, politely but firmly, that I mind my own affairs." Margaret glanced at her mother, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. That sounded very much like her father, proud, stubborn, unwilling to admit he might have been deceived. "I continued gathering evidence," the Duke said. "I hoped that with sufficient documentation, I could persuade your father to reconsider. But time ran short. By the time I had proof that would be incontrovertible, the wedding was only days away. I sent word to your father again. He did not respond. So you took matters into your own hands." "I did." The Duke's gaze held hers. "I sent a message to Mr. Whitmore the night before your wedding. I informed him that if he appeared at St. George's, I would expose his debts and his intentions publicly, in detail that would destroy any remaining credit he possessed. I gave him a choice, disappear quietly or face complete ruin. He chose to disappear. He did. Which confirmed my suspicions about his character. A man of honor would have faced the consequences. Whitmore simply fled." Margaret sat back, processing this torrent of information. Mr. Whitmore had not abandoned her out of cold feet or sudden realization. He had fled because he was a coward and a fraud, caught in his own deceptions. "You said you acted publicly to preserve my reputation," she said. "Explain that to me. Because from where I sit, my reputation is in ruins." The Duke's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Had I done nothing and had Mr. Whitmore simply failed to appear, you would have been left standing at the altar with no explanation. Society would have assumed the fault was yours, that something about you had driven him away. The scandal would have been absolute and the blame entirely on your shoulders." He paused, then continued. "By claiming responsibility myself, by stating publicly that I had prevented the marriage, I shifted the narrative. The question became not, what is wrong with Lady Margaret, but, why did the Duke intervene? Your reputation transformed from rejected bride to protected lady. The scandal attached to the mystery of my motives rather than to any supposed failing in you. Margaret stared at him, understanding dawning. You made yourself part of the scandal. I made myself the scandal, he corrected quietly. By the time society finishes speculating about my reasons for intervening, whether I acted from honor, from personal interest, from some hidden connection to your family, the question of your worthiness will have faded into irrelevance. It was brilliant, ruthlessly effective and utterly brilliant. The Duke had sacrificed his own privacy, his own reputation for detachment and discretion, to protect hers. Why? Margaret asked again, but this time the question held different weight. Why would you do this for someone you don't know? The Duke was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and sincere. Because I have seen what happens to women who are blamed for men's failures. I have watched society destroy reputations over scandals that were not of the woman's making. And I have the power to prevent such destruction, at least in this instance. It seemed unconscionable not to use that power. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not gratitude precisely. Not yet. But a recognition that this man, whatever his methods, had acted from genuine conviction rather than self-interest. What happens now? She asked. That depends on what you wish to happen, the Duke said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. I have evidence that could destroy Mr. Whitmore's reputation permanently. I can make it public if you desire. Or we can let him disappear into obscurity. The choice is yours. It was the first time since this entire catastrophe began that someone had offered Margaret a choice. She looked at the Duke, this man who had upended her life, who had protected her without asking permission, who had bound his name to hers in ways that would echo through society for months, and felt the first stirring of something that might eventually become gratitude. But beneath that was anger, resentment, the bitter knowledge that her agency had been stripped from her at every turn. First by Mr. Whitmore's deception, then by her father's refusal to listen, finally by the Duke's intervention, no matter how well-intentioned. I need time to consider, she said finally. This is not a decision to be made hastily. The Duke inclined his head. Of course, take whatever time you require. I will make myself available should you wish to discuss the matter further. He rose to leave and Margaret stood as well. They faced each other across the drawing room, two people whose lives had become unexpectedly entangled. Your Grace, Margaret said, I do not yet know whether to thank you or curse you for what you have done. A ghost of a smile touched the Duke's lips. I would not presume to tell you which is appropriate, Lady Margaret, but I hope that in time, you will at least believe that I acted with your best interests at heart. He bowed and departed, leaving Margaret standing in the drawing room with her thoughts in turmoil and her future uncertain. Her mother rose from her corner, book forgotten. What will you do, my dear? Margaret turned to look out the window at Berkeley Square, where life continued despite the chaos of her own circumstances. What would she do? She did not know yet. But for the first time since standing at that empty altar, she felt a spark of something besides shock and humiliation. She felt angry. And beneath the anger, she felt determined. The Duke had given her a choice. She would not waste it. I will think, Margaret said quietly, and then I will decide. For myself. It was a small assertion of control, but it was a beginning. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a private messenger to Lord Hale's study. Margaret knew something was wrong when her father summoned her with uncharacteristic urgency, his face pale beneath his graying hair. Close the door, he said as she entered. Margaret did so, then took the seat across from his desk. The letter lay between them, its wax seal already broken, the paper thick and expensive. It's from Mr. Whitmore's solicitor, her father said without preamble. Or rather, from a solicitor acting on his behalf. Margaret's stomach tightened. What does it say? That Mr. Whitmore is prepared to take legal action regarding breach of contract. That the marriage settlement was signed and binding, and that by preventing the ceremony from proceeding, we have violated the terms of that agreement. Her father's jaw clenched. They are demanding compensation. £5,000 to be paid within 30 days, or they will file suit in Chancery. For a moment, Margaret could only stare. Then fury rose in her throat, hot and bitter. He disappeared. He abandoned the wedding. And now he demands money for the privilege of not having married me? The letter claims his absence was due to duress. That he was threatened and intimidated by parties unknown, though they carefully avoid naming the Duke directly, and that this constitutes interference in a legal contract. It's extortion. It's strategy, her father corrected grimly. Whitmore knows we cannot afford a lengthy court battle. The scandal alone would destroy what remains of your reputation. And the legal expenses. He shook his head. £5,000 is unconscionable, but it may be less costly than fighting. No. Margaret stood abruptly. We will not pay him. We cannot reward his deception with money. Margaret, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. He is a fraud and a coward who attempted to marry me solely for my dowry. The Duke has evidence of this. Surely that evidence would be relevant in any legal proceedings? Her father's expression shifted to something uncomfortable. Which brings us to the other problem. If we introduce the Duke's evidence in court, it becomes a matter of public record. Every detail of Whitmore's debts, his intentions, his character, and your involvement with him, will be examined and discussed in the most public forum imaginable. The scandal sheets would feast on it for months. Margaret sank back into her chair, understanding the trap they were in. Silence meant capitulating to extortion. Truth meant exposing themselves to even greater scandal. What does the Duke say? She asked quietly. I have not yet informed him. I wanted to speak with you first. Her father leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. But we must involve him, Margaret. This concerns him as much as it concerns us. Whitmore's solicitor is clearly attempting to force his hand, to make the Duke's intervention too costly to maintain. Margaret nodded slowly. Send word to Westley. Tell him we need to meet. Today if possible. The Duke arrived at Berkeley Square within 2 hours, his expression grave as he was shown into the study where Margaret and her father waited. He listened in silence as Lord Hale explained the situation, his gray eyes growing progressively darker as the implications became clear. When her father finished, the Duke was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice controlled but edged with anger. Whitmore is desperate. This confirms it. Can he actually succeed with such a suit? Margaret asked. Possibly. The marriage contract was legally binding. The ceremony's failure to proceed could technically be construed as breach of contract. The Duke's mouth tightened. Of course, the contract was entered into under false pretenses, which would invalidate it. But proving that in court would require exposing all the evidence I have gathered. Which is precisely what he's counting on, Lord Hale said. He believes we will choose to pay rather than face public scrutiny. The Duke rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Margaret watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in every movement. He was angry, she realized. Genuinely, deeply angry in a way his composed exterior barely concealed. I have copies of letters between Whitmore and his creditors, he said finally. Detailed accounts of his debts. Testimony from 3 separate witnesses regarding his gambling losses. Documentation of fraudulent investment schemes he attempted. And a signed statement from his own former valet describing Whitmore's explicit intention to marry for money to settle his obligations. Margaret's breath caught. That would destroy him. Completely and permanently. No gentleman's club would admit him. No respectable household would receive him. His family would likely disown him to protect their own name. He would be finished in society. Then we use it, Margaret said firmly. We present the evidence and expose him for what he is. The Duke turned from the window to face her. Are you certain? Because once that information becomes public, there is no retrieving it. Your name will be attached to this scandal indefinitely. Every time someone mentions Whitmore's disgrace, they will also mention the woman he attempted to deceive. You will be gossip fodder for years. I am already gossip fodder, Margaret said quietly. At least this way the gossip will include the truth. Your family will also be examined, the Duke continued, his gaze shifting to her father. There will be questions about why the match was approved, why Whitmore's character was not more carefully investigated. Some may suggest that Lord Hale was negligent in his duty to protect his daughter. Her father flinched but held the Duke's gaze. I was negligent. I should have investigated more thoroughly. I should have listened when you tried to warn me. He drew a breath. But that is my burden to bear, not my daughter's. If Margaret wishes to fight this, then we fight. Margaret felt a rush of gratitude toward her father, complicated by the recognition of how much this admission cost his pride. There is one other consideration, the Duke said, his attention returning to Margaret. If we expose Whitmore publicly, there will be those who question my motives for doing so. Some will claim I acted not from honor but from personal interest in you. That I destroyed your engagement because I wanted you for myself. Heat rose in Margaret's cheeks, though she kept her voice steady. And does that concern you? It concerns me insofar as it affects you, the Duke said quietly. Such speculation could complicate your prospects for future marriage. Many men would hesitate to court a woman whose name is so intimately linked with mine. Then they would be fools, Margaret said with more heat than she intended. Because any man of sense would recognize that you acted with honor while my former betrothed acted with duplicity. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. Surprise, perhaps. Or approval. You are generous in your assessment. I am realistic, Margaret corrected. You have given me agency when others have tried to strip it away. Whatever society chooses to speculate, I know the truth of your character. And I will not reward Mr. Whitmore's extortion with silence. The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Margaret had the sense of being evaluated, measured against some internal standard she could not see. Very well, he said finally. Then we make our stand. Together. The Duke's solicitors moved with impressive speed. Within 3 days they had prepared a response to Whitmore's legal threats that made it abundantly clear no settlement would be forthcoming. Moreover, they indicated that should Mr. Whitmore wish to pursue litigation, Lord Hale and the Duke of Westleigh would be prepared to present substantial evidence of fraud, deception, and breach of good faith on Mr. Whitmore's part. The response was delivered on a Monday. By Tuesday evening, Whitmore's solicitor had requested a private meeting. He's frightened, the Duke said when he called to inform Margaret and her father. He knows what exposure would mean. He's trying to negotiate. What are his terms? Lord Hale asked. Complete withdrawal of all legal claims in exchange for our silence regarding his debts and character. He wants assurance that the evidence I have gathered will not be made public. Margaret, seated in the drawing room beside her father, felt anger flare again. So he still escapes consequences. He simply disappears, leaving his debts unpaid and his reputation intact, while I remain the jilted bride. Not intact, the Duke said quietly. Word has already spread through certain circles about his financial difficulties. His creditors are not fools. They know he has fled to avoid payment. His reputation is damaged, if not destroyed. The question is whether we press that damage to its full extent. You said we would let Margaret decide, Lord Hale observed. The Duke's gaze settled on Margaret, steady and patient. I did. And I will abide by whatever decision she makes. Margaret rose and moved to the window, looking out over Berkeley Square. Evening was settling over Mayfair, the lamplighters making their rounds. In the houses surrounding the square, families were gathering for dinner, attending to correspondence, preparing for evening entertainments. Normal life continuing despite her chaos. She thought of Mr. Whitmore hiding somewhere, sending intermediaries to fight his battles while he remained safely distant. She thought of the debts he had accrued through reckless gambling and poor judgment, the lies he had told, the cold calculation with which he had courted her, all while planning to use her dowry to settle his obligations. She thought of other women he might deceive if allowed to quietly escape, other families he might manipulate, and she thought of herself standing at that altar, abandoned and humiliated while 200 witnesses watched. No, she said, turning back to face the Duke and her father. No silence. No negotiation. If Mr. Whitmore wishes to avoid exposure, he should have considered that before attempting to extort £5,000 from my family. Margaret, her father began. I know what this means, Papa. I understand the scandal will intensify. But it will be scandal with truth behind it, not speculation. And I would rather be known as the woman who exposed a fraud than the woman who was too frightened to defend herself. The Duke's expression remained carefully neutral, but Margaret thought she detected approval in his eyes. If we proceed, the exposure must be strategic. We do not simply release evidence indiscriminately. We choose the forum carefully. What do you suggest? Lord Hale asked. There is to be a dinner at Lady Ashford's next week. She is one of the most influential hostesses in London, and her gatherings are attended by everyone who matters in society. If Margaret were to attend, and if the subject of Mr. Whitmore were to arise, I could speak, Margaret finished. Publicly. With witnesses who could spread the truth faster than any scandal sheet. It would require courage, the Duke warned. You would be subjecting yourself to intense scrutiny. Every word you speak would be analyzed and repeated. I have already been subjected to intense scrutiny, Your Grace. At least this time I will control the narrative. Her father looked between them, his expression troubled. Lady Ashford has already withdrawn her invitation to us. After the scandal at St. George's, we have been quietly excluded from most social engagements. Then we get the invitation reinstated, the Duke said. He turned to Margaret. Lady Ashford is a friend of my mother's. If I were to indicate that I planned to attend, and that I hoped Lady Margaret might also be present, she would extend an invitation. She would not risk offending my family. You would use your influence that way? Margaret asked. I would use every resource at my disposal to ensure you have the platform you deserve, the Duke replied quietly. Margaret felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Not quite trust, it was too soon for that, but something approaching it. This man, who owed her nothing, who had already risked his reputation for her protection, was offering to risk it again. Then we accept, she said, and we prepare to tell the truth. The dinner at Lady Ashford's was held the following Wednesday. Margaret dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep blue silk that made her look older, more serious. Her mother helped arrange her hair, her hands trembling slightly. "Are you certain about this, my dear?" Lady Hale asked for the third time. "I am certain I cannot remain silent," Margaret replied. "That will have to be enough." The Duke arrived to escort them in his own carriage, a courtesy that did not go unnoticed by the servants or the neighbors who happened to be watching from their windows. He handed Margaret in with the same careful courtesy he had shown at the church, though this time his gray eyes held something warmer. Respect, perhaps, or solidarity. Lady Ashford's townhouse blazed with candlelight. The dinner was attended by 30 guests, all carefully selected from the upper echelons of society. Margaret felt their eyes on her the moment she entered, felt the whispers start immediately. The jilted bride. The woman abandoned at the altar. The lady whose wedding had been disrupted by the Duke of Westleigh himself. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Margaret sat between an elderly baronet who pointedly ignored her and a younger gentleman who seemed uncertain whether speaking to her would enhance or damage his own reputation. The Duke was seated farther down the table, but she felt his presence like an anchor in stormy water. It was during the ladies' withdrawal to the drawing room, while the gentlemen remained with their port, that the opportunity arose. Lady Bexley, who had withdrawn her invitation to Margaret just days after the failed wedding, turned to her with false sweetness. "My dear Lady Margaret, how courageous of you to attend tonight. I confess we were all quite surprised by your appearance." The room quieted. Every woman present turned to watch, scenting drama. Margaret met Lady Bexley's gaze steadily. "I saw no reason to hide, Lady Bexley. I have done nothing of which I am ashamed." "Of course not, dear," Lady Bexley said, her tone dripping condescension. "Though one does wonder what could have driven Mr. Whitmore to such desperate measures. To abandon one's bride at the altar. It speaks to some terrible revelation, does it not?" It was the opening Margaret needed. She drew a breath, aware that every word she spoke would be repeated in drawing rooms across London by morning. "It does indeed speak to a terrible revelation," Margaret said clearly. "The revelation that Mr. Whitmore is a man of no honor and considerable debt. That he courted me not from affection or respect, but from calculated intention to use my dowry to settle obligations he had incurred through gambling and fraud. That he had already negotiated with his creditors based on the expectation of my marriage settlement, promising payment that would have come from my family's resources." Shocked silence. Then an eruption of whispers. Lady Bexley's face had gone pale. "That is a serious accusation." "It is a documented fact," Margaret interrupted. "The Duke of Westleigh has evidence of every claim I have made. Letters, testimony, financial records. Mr. Whitmore did not abandon me, Lady Bexley. He fled when faced with exposure of his deception." The drawing room had erupted into barely contained chaos. Women were whispering frantically, leaning close to share speculation, their eyes wide with shock. Margaret stood, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "I tell you this not from spite but from a desire for truth. Mr. Whitmore attempted to extort £5,000 from my family in exchange for our silence. We refused. I will not be silenced by threats, and I will not allow a man of such character to escape consequences through intimidation." The door to the drawing room opened, and the gentlemen began to file in from their port. The Duke was among the first, his gaze finding Margaret immediately. She saw him assess the situation in an instant, saw him move toward her with deliberate purpose. "Lady Margaret," he said quietly as he reached her side. "Are you well?" "I am," she said, and was surprised to find it true. Her heart was pounding and her hands were trembling, but she felt more present, more alive than she had in weeks. "I have told them the truth." The Duke's expression shifted into something that might have been pride. "Then society will have to adjust its understanding accordingly." And adjust it did. By the time Margaret left Lady Ashford's townhouse that evening, the narrative had already begun to shift. She was no longer the abandoned bride but the woman who had narrowly escaped a fortune hunter. No longer pitiable but courageous. No longer the subject of scandal but the victim who had found her voice. The truth, as it turned out, was far more powerful than silence had ever been. The aftermath of Lady Ashford's dinner unfolded with the inexorable momentum of a stone rolling downhill. By the following morning, every drawing room in Mayfair was discussing Mr. Whitmore's disgrace. By afternoon, the scandal sheets had published lurid accounts of debts and deception. By week's end, Thomas Whitmore had fled London entirely, his creditors closing in and his reputation in complete ruins. Margaret watched it unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and detachment. She had told the truth. Society had believed her. Justice, of a sort, had been served, The invitations began to return within days. Cautiously at first, a small musicale and afternoon tea, but with increasing confidence as it became clear that public opinion had shifted decisively in Margaret's favor. She was no longer the jilted bride but the discerning woman who had been saved from a terrible mistake. The victim who had found her courage and spoken. Her mother wept with relief when Lady Jersey herself sent a personal note expressing admiration for Margaret's strength of character. Her father walked with his shoulders straighter, the shadow of shame lifting from his bearing. Even Cecilia, who had been mortified by the initial scandal, now boasted to her friends about her sister's bravery. The Hale family's standing not only recovered but strengthened. They were no longer simply respectable. They were interesting, worthy of discussion and, more importantly, worthy of respect. Through it all, the Duke of Westleigh remained a steady presence in Margaret's life. He called at appropriate intervals, escorted the family to select events, and continued to be publicly associated with Margaret's defense. His involvement lent weight to her claims and protection to her reputation. But as the weeks passed and spring settled into early summer, Margaret began to notice a subtle shift. The Duke's visits became slightly less frequent. His invitations more carefully formal. When they spoke, there was a new distance in his manner, polite, respectful, but distinctly removed. He was withdrawing. Margaret realized it one evening at the theater, where the Duke sat in his family's box across from theirs. He acknowledged her with a bow and a small smile but made no move to visit during intermission. When their eyes met across the crowded theater, his expression was pleasant but unrevealing. He believes his role is complete, Margaret thought with sudden clarity. He protected me, helped me reclaim my reputation, and now he is stepping back to allow me to move forward with my life. The realization settled over her like cold water. She should have been relieved, grateful. The Duke had given her exactly what she needed: protection without possession, defense without claim. He had never once suggested that his intervention entitled him to anything from her. And yet, Margaret sat through the second half of the performance without seeing any of it, her mind turning over a truth she had been carefully avoiding for weeks. She did not want the Duke to withdraw. She did not want this careful distance, this polite removal from her life. She wanted him to stay. Not because she needed his protection anymore. Not because society expected it or because propriety demanded it. Because somewhere between the altar at St. George's and this theater box, between humiliation and truth-telling, between shock and courage, she had come to value his presence in her life in ways that had nothing to do with scandal or reputation. She had come to care for him, to respect him, to seek out his particular brand of quiet strength and unflinching honesty. And he was leaving because he believed that was the honorable thing to do. Margaret waited 3 days before acting. 3 days of careful thought, of examining her own motives, of ensuring that what she felt was genuine and not simply gratitude or residual attachment from shared crisis. On the 4th day, she sent a note to Westleigh House requesting a private audience with the Duke. Not at her family's home, with her mother hovering as chaperone. Not at some public venue where they must maintain appropriate distance. She wanted to speak with him openly, honestly, without performance or pretense. The Duke's response came within hours. He would receive her at his townhouse the following afternoon, with his housekeeper present to maintain propriety. Margaret dressed with care, choosing a walking dress of soft green muslin that she knew flattered her coloring. Not because she sought to seduce or manipulate but because she wanted to feel confident. To feel like herself. Westleigh House was imposing, a grand facade in Grosvenor Square that spoke to generations of wealth and influence. The butler showed her into a private study paneled in dark wood and lined with books, where the Duke awaited. He rose as she entered, his expression welcoming but carefully neutral. "Lady Margaret, I confess your note surprised me." "I imagine it did," Margaret said, accepting the seat he offered. The housekeeper took a position near the door, discreet but present. "I wish to speak with you privately." "Is something wrong? Has Whitmore attempted further contact?" "No, nothing like that." Margaret folded her hands in her lap, choosing her words with care. "I wanted to thank you. Properly. Without the weight of crisis or the pressure of society's eyes." The Duke's expression softened slightly. "There is no need for thanks. I did only what honor required." "You did far more than that," Margaret said quietly. "You risked your own reputation, your privacy, your standing in society. You gave me agency when others had stripped it away. You defended me without claiming me. And you trusted me to make my own choices, even when those choices were difficult. You would have found your courage without my intervention," the Duke said. "I simply provided an opportunity for it to emerge." Margaret shook her head. "You provided more than opportunity. You provided partnership, alliance. You treated me as an equal worthy of truth and trust, not as a problem to be managed or a burden to be shouldered. She paused, gathering her courage. And now you are withdrawing, stepping back, believing I think that your role is complete. The Duke's eyes flickered with something unguarded before his composure reasserted itself. I thought it appropriate. Your reputation has stabilized. Society has accepted the truth. You no longer require my protection, and I did not wish my continued presence to complicate your future prospects. My future prospects, Margaret repeated. She rose from her seat and moved to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens behind the townhouse. You mean you did not wish potential suitors to be deterred by the speculation about your involvement in my life? Yes. Margaret turned to face him. And if I told you I do not care about deterring such suitors? That I would rather have honest connection with one man than superficial interest from many? The Duke had gone very still. Margaret. You have been so careful, she continued, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. So determined not to claim me or presume anything. And I honor that. But I find I must speak plainly, because I cannot bear the thought of you withdrawing out of some misguided sense of propriety. She drew a breath. I do not want you to step back. I want you to stay. Not as protector or defender, but as yourself. As the man who saw me when I was at my lowest and offered truth instead of pity. Who gave me choice instead of rescue. Who treated me as worthy of honesty even when honesty was difficult. The silence stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then the Duke crossed the room to stand before her, his gray eyes searching hers. You honor me with your words. But I must know, is this gratitude? Or something more? It is more, Margaret said simply. Far more. Though I confess I am still learning the shape of it. All I know is that when I imagine my future, I wish to imagine you in it. Not because society expects it. Not because scandal has bound us. But because I choose it. The Duke's hand came up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. You're certain? Because once said, I will not allow you to take such words back. I am not a man who guards his heart lightly, Margaret. If you give me hope, I will hold it sacred. Margaret's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze, the vulnerability beneath his careful control. I am certain. Though I cannot promise to be easy or uncomplicated. I have opinions and will. I will question you and challenge you and refuse to be managed. Good, the Duke said, and Margaret saw something almost like relief in his expression. I would expect nothing less. I do not want a wife who defers and acquiesces. I want a partner who thinks and feels and chooses freely. Then you have one, Margaret said softly. If you wish it. The Duke's thumb traced her cheekbone with reverent care. I wish it more than I have wished for anything in a very long time. But I will not presume. I will not assume your acceptance simply because we have spoken plainly. He stepped back slightly, and Margaret felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. Then he took her hand, his grip warm and steady. Lady Margaret Hale, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion Margaret could see in his eyes. Would you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife? Not because scandal demands it. Not because society expects it. But because I have come to admire your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to be diminished by circumstances. Because I want to spend my days in conversation with you, in partnership with you, in the building of a life that honors both our choices. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or overwhelm. They were tears of recognition, of being truly seen. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you. And not because you saved me, but because you allowed me to save myself. Not because you claimed me, but because you gave me the freedom to choose. I will marry you because when I look at you, I see a man of honor and integrity who has shown me what true partnership looks like. The Duke's smile was like sunrise, slow, warm, transforming his entire face. Then we are agreed. A union of mutual choice and equal respect. Equal respect, Margaret repeated, and found herself smiling in return. Though I reserve the right to disagree with you frequently. I would be disappointed if you did not. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was both proper and intimate. Then, with the housekeeper still discreetly present, he drew her into his arms for a careful, restrained embrace that nonetheless communicated volumes. Margaret rested her head against his chest and felt his heart beating steady and strong. This was not rescue. Not spectacle. Not the dramatic culmination of scandal. This was choice. Deliberate, mutual, honest choice. The announcement of their engagement was met with varying degrees of surprise, speculation, and approval across London society. Some claimed they had known all along that the Duke's intervention had been motivated by personal attachment. Others insisted it was a perfectly logical match given the circumstances. Margaret found she did not particularly care what society thought. The wedding took place 3 months later at the Duke's estate in Hampshire, a private ceremony attended only by family and close friends. No crowds of curious onlookers. No whispers or speculation. Just vows spoken freely, honestly, between two people who had found each other through crisis and chosen each other despite it. As Margaret stood beside the Duke, her husband now, in the chapel on his estate, she reflected on how far she had traveled from that terrible morning at St. George's. She had been abandoned at an altar, humiliated before society, forced to rebuild her reputation from ruins. But she had also found her voice, her courage, her capacity to choose her own path. And she had found a man who saw her not as something to be pitied or rescued, but as someone worthy of truth and trust and partnership. When the Duke turned to her after the ceremony, his gray eyes warm with affection and respect, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness. Not because she had been chosen, but because she had chosen. And that, she thought as they walked together into the bright summer afternoon, made all the difference. Thanks for listening till the end. If you enjoyed this story, tap like, hit subscribe, and don't stop here, there's another story waiting for you. Just click the video on your screen to keep going.